meantime, what we're going to do is we're going to continue our journey through the Gospel of Mark. And this morning, what we're going to do is see just 2 verses from the Gospel of Mark. We're only going to look at 2 verses from Mark's Gospel. And even though these verses are short, they still provide us with this beautiful picture of just how far Jesus has gone to relate himself to us. We'll see it from Mark chapter 1, verses 12 and 13. Verses 12 and 13. At once, the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness, or to the desert. And he was in the desert 40 days, being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and angels attended to him. From those 2 short verses, what we're going to see together this morning is that Jesus relates to us so that we can have relationship with him. Jesus relates to us so that we can have relationship with him. And I love the way that Mark portrays Jesus in his gospel, because he portrays Jesus as someone who is relatable. Remember, Mark is writing this gospel to Roman Christians in the city of Rome, probably enduring intense persecution from the Roman Empire. Mark is writing it in a way that those Roman readers would be able to relate to Jesus. I mean, we've got action. It says that immediately Jesus is sent out into the wilderness. This is a fast-paced story. We've got violence, right? It's Jesus versus Satan. There's this cosmic conflict within this text. We've got wild animals, we've got the wilderness, we've got demons and devils and angels. There's all kinds of things that Roman people would have been incredibly interested in, packed into even just these 2 single verses. Mark writes about Jesus in a way that is ultimately relatable, but he also writes about Jesus in a way that makes Jesus a little bit unattainable. And when I think about the way that Jesus is presented here, I think about all of my favorite characters from my favorite stories, from my favorite movies, my favorite TV shows. And I think that really that's kind of one measure of a good story, is having a character or having characters that we can relate to. That's what makes a story a good story. When you naturally gravitate toward a character, that's part of what makes us like certain stories. So when I think of these characters, I think of Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. This is a total nerd moment, okay? I'm going to push my glasses up. I'm going to get ready to use my nerd voice. Aragorn, the king of Gondor. Okay, that's who I relate to when I read Lord of the Rings, because look, he's ruggedly handsome. He's a swordsman. He's compassionate. He looks like white Jesus. What is not to love? That is who I relate to. But then my family, they counter that. They come back and they say I look more like this guy. This is Samwise Gamgee, also from Lord of the Rings. He's the best friend character who's really good at cooking. That's who I'm supposed to relate to according to my family. Now, I don't know, maybe you're not into Lord of the Rings. Maybe you're more of a Star Wars kind of person. Well, that's okay, because I also love the new Disney Plus series, The Mandalorian. I relate very closely to the main character of that series as well, because it's like a space western. He's like a cowboy bounty hunter, and he adopts this child. The Mandalorian has a child. My wife and I have a child. We are the same. The relationship is there. You can't deny it. Maybe you're not into nerd stuff at all. No, like you want real TV, reality TV, documentaries, biographies, nature stuff. Maybe that's the kind of entertainment that you're into. Well, there's still characters within those stories that we can readily relate to. My favorite documentary series is on Netflix. It is in fact a documentary. I looked it up in the Netflix library of shows. It is labeled as a documentary, and it's called Meat Eater. My wife, she would say that it is a hunting show, not a documentary, but that's not what Netflix says. So this documentary is hosted by a guy named Steve Rinella, and he's my hero. Absolutely. Like if I could be like one person other than Jesus, man, I want to be like Steve Rinella. Because Steve, we're on a first name basis. Steve, he's a New York Times bestselling author. He owns a successful company. He has a TV show. He runs a cool podcast. He writes books, and he hunts all over the world. If I can be like Steve Rinella, who I relate to very closely, then man, I want to be like Steve Rinella. No matter the kinds of stories that we listen to, the kinds of stories that we love, there's characters in them that we relate to. There's characters in them that we relate to, and that's what makes us like those stories. But the problem is that there's a little bit of tension. If we're going to be honest, there's a little bit of tension between who we want to be and who we actually are. There's a little bit of tension between those favorite characters that we love so much and who we actually are in our everyday lives. I think it's a tension we're all familiar with because let's say you're scrolling Facebook one day and you come across one of those quizzes on Facebook that says, which character from The Office are you? And let's say you take that quiz because you know that you're Jim. You know that you're Pam. You know that is who you are. You know you are the main character from The Office. You know that you guys are the heroes. You're the perfect couple. That's who you know you are. And you take the quiz and you get Michael Scott. You get Michael Scott. And then what you do, this is what seals the deal. This is what sets it in stone. This is what makes you Michael Scott. You take the quiz a second time because you think you're going to get Jim and you think you're going to get Pam. Who you want to be is not who you actually are, and it creates a little bit of tension. There's tension between who we ought to be and who we actually are. There's tension between me and Aragorn. I don't look anything like him. I don't look like white Jesus. I'm good at being friends and making snacks, according to my family. That's why they say I'm Samwise Gamgee. I'm not anything like the Mandalorian. I'm the furthest thing from a bounty hunter, the furthest thing from a cowboy. I'm nothing like Stephen Ornella. I get in trouble when I talk about hunting too much, let alone spend too much time in the woods. There's a tension between who we are and who we want to be. There's a tension that exists, but it's precisely that tension that Mark portrays in the person of Jesus. What Mark is trying to show his Roman readers is that Jesus is relatable, that you can get to know Jesus, that he's not that hard to get to know, but it's kind of hard to be like Jesus. Jesus is ultimately relatable, but at the same time, Jesus is ultimately unattainable. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to explore that tension together. We're going to examine that tension and see how maybe we can resolve that tension. To see how maybe we can close that gap between who Jesus is and who we are. To close that gap between who we ought to be and who we actually are in reality. To see how we can be a little bit more like Jesus. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to take another look at Mark chapter 1, verses 12 and 13. Just these two sentences. And this is the beauty of expository preaching. That you can preach verse by verse, phrase by phrase. You can dig deep into what the text says. You can catch some of the nuance and the background that Mark has incorporated into his gospel. So that's what we're going to do this morning, is very slowly walk through these two verses and see just how far Jesus has gone to relate himself to us. What we're going to see is that Jesus, he is relatable. Jesus is relatable. We see it in the very first verse here, verse 12. At once, the Spirit sent him out into the desert or into the wilderness. At once, the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness. What happens for Jesus here is kind of tough because he goes from baptism, he goes from this moment of triumph, he goes from this moment where God is speaking, where the Holy Spirit descends upon him, this triumphant moment, this mountaintop moment, to now he's thrown into the desert to fight the devil. He goes from baptism to fighting Satan. His triumph is followed by his temptation. You might think, man, that sounds really tough to be Jesus, but I think the same thing is true for us. I think that's why Jesus is relatable in these verses, because often for us, we'll do something or experience some kind of triumph, and then we find that it's followed up by temptation. Think about how temptation works. Think about it for a second. Temptation, it doesn't set in when you're doing something good. No, when you're doing your morning devotions, you're probably not tempted to do something abhorrently evil. When you're having coffee with your pastor during the week, you're probably not going to become the worst sinner known to man. No, that's not when temptation sets in. Temptation sets in after God has done something good in your life. And the enemy steps in, he tries to undo it. That's when temptation sets in. That's when temptation takes its hold, after God has done something good. Sometimes that's when we need to be most on our guard, is after God has done something good in our lives. And this is just a real quick, like, Bible nerd aside. We can't pass this up. This is expository preaching. So there's a word there about the Spirit sending Jesus out. Once the Spirit sent him out. And that word for sent, it shows up in the Old Testament as well. But that word in the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's sometimes translated a little bit, with a little bit more of a stronger connotation. Not just that Jesus was sent out, but more that Jesus was thrown out into the wilderness, more that Jesus was compelled by God's Spirit to go into the wilderness. And in the Old Testament, that word was used specifically in reference to the sacrificial system, because in the Old Testament, Jesus wasn't around to deal with the sins of God's people. So there had to be some kind of reparations made, some kind of payment, some kind of atonement for their sin. So there was a sacrifice that was made, usually animal sacrifices, to take the place, to take the punishment of God's people. They would kind of trade places. Their punishment would be given to the animal's life would then be given to them. That was how the sacrificial system, just in a nutshell, kind of worked. And there was one animal in particular, known as the scapegoat. And the scapegoat was the animal that was symbolically carrying all of the guilt, carrying all of the shame, all of the sin, all of the wrongdoing was placed upon the scapegoat symbolically. And then that animal was driven out into the wilderness. You can probably pick up on what Mark is doing here in his gospel, because most Bible scholars believe that when Mark uses that word, he's making that reference back to the Old Testament, back to the scapegoat, that just as Jesus was driven out into the wilderness, Jesus will be driven to the cross, where just like the scapegoat, Jesus will take all of the blame and all of the sin and all of the shame and all of the guilt, and Jesus will take our place. That's the beauty of the gospel. We see it here in Mark chapter 1. We'll see it all the way in Mark chapter 16 when Jesus heads to the cross. Now, I know that had nothing to do with triumph or temptation, but like you can't pass that one up. That one was way too good, right? Now, when I was in high school, I didn't have much experience with triumph. I was not athletic then. I am not athletic now. I am wearing a borrowed jersey from our lead pastor because he asked me to. I'm not a Colts fan or a Peyton Manning fan. Like, it's just not me. So I wasn't athletic. I didn't win a lot. I played some sports, but I wasn't very good at them. But I will never forget, there was one victory that I had in high school wrestling that was unforgettable, because I pinned this kid that I faced. I pinned him in like 6 seconds flat. It was the best wrestling win that I ever recorded. Maybe one of my only wrestling wins. I didn't keep very good track. But I pinned this kid in 6 seconds flat. Nobody thought I was going to win. Coach didn't think I was going to win. Teammates, they didn't think I was going to win. To make matters worse, Coach didn't really know how to pronounce my last name. I get it. It starts with a Z. Kind of complicated. It's phonetic though, Zafiroff. It's not that hard. But he was convinced that my last name was Zafiroff. Okay? Zafiroff. Didn't think I was going to win. Can't get my name right. None of my teammates, they didn't think I was going to win either. But then when I pinned this kid in 6 seconds flat, everybody starts to they stand up and they start cheering. They're shouting, Zafiroff, Zafiroff, Zafiroff. And I didn't even care. Didn't even matter. I won a wrestling match. I'm reveling in victory, maybe even on the verge of pride, maybe even on the verge of arrogance. And then I did something. Did something I probably shouldn't have done. Found out later that I definitely shouldn't have done. I took my hands like this. I made the symbol of a Z. And they're all chanting, Zafiroff. And then I join in with them. I'm standing on the mat, Zafiroff, Zafiroff, Zafiroff. And then something weird happens. Something real weird. The coach, he runs over to me. He smacks my hands down. He says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "What do you mean, coach? I was chanting. I won. I was just excited." And he said, "No, you can get disqualified for a display like that. You just about forfeited your victory because you were gloating, because you were showboating." I didn't know that was the case. But in that moment, I was triumphant, right? I was victorious. And then directly after that moment, I was tempted by pride. Let pride get in the way of accepting that victory the way that I probably should have. I think it works in much the same way for all of us, that we're tempted, not necessarily when things are going good, but when we think things are all right. Right after that, that's when temptation sets in. Temptation sets in, and that's when we need to be most on our guard. I see this happen all the time in student ministry. All the time in student ministry. What happens is we'll go to a youth camp. We'll go to a youth retreat. And then students will come home and they'll be like, "I love Jesus." And then 1 week later, it's like, "Who's Jesus?" "Jesus who? Church? What? I don't go to church. What are you talking about? I don't need to be in service. I don't need to attend and service." Like, what are you talking about? So quickly that passion fades, because what happens is, we come back to the real world. We're not in the camp bubble or the retreat bubble. And then temptation sets back in. Those old habits set back in. Old friends come back around. And then everything that God's done at camp is quickly forgotten. It works the same for us as adults. We come to Sunday morning. We get our spiritual experience. And then we head into our week. We head into our work week. And what happens? Those friends we probably shouldn't be spending a lot of time with, they maybe lead us astray. Those old habits that we thought we had dealt with, they show back up. We say, "This is going to be a different week. I'm going to read my Bible this week. I'm going to pray this week. It's going to be different." And then it's not. And week after week after week after week, it's not. And then it never is, when are we going to step in and change that cycle? Instead of it going from triumph to temptation to failure, when are we going to step in and change that cycle and it goes from triumph to temptation to victory, just like Jesus does in these verses? I think the moment that that cycle changes is when we remember that temptation follows triumph. When we're prepared for temptation, just as Jesus was in these verses, when we're prepared, we can do what Jesus did. We can conquer temptation as well. Now, the next phrase in Mark chapter 13, once the Spirit sent him out into the desert, and he was in the desert 40 days. And that next phrase, short phrase, what Mark does is he imports all kinds of Old Testament imagery into this story about Jesus. Because the wilderness, especially through the Old Testament, it was this place where some of God's most trusted servants faced some of their most severe tests. And real quick, if we just do like a flyby of this theme, it will show us how Jesus is relatable. Jesus is relatable here because even if we're trustworthy, we're still going to be tested. Even the trustworthy are tested. Tests are even for people who are trustworthy. I mean, they were for Jesus. Why would we think that it's any different for us? Okay, so flyby in Scripture, real quick. We start in the beginning. Adam and Eve were in the garden, tempted, kind of like a wild place, tempted by Satan himself. What happens? They fail. They fail. They partake of the forbidden fruit. We got, Moses and Israel, God's chosen people, God's chosen leader. God brings them out of Egypt in the Exodus. They're in the wilderness, the place of testing. This is their chance. They can prove themselves. They can show God that He can trust them. What do? Take us back to Egypt. We don't like it here. They fail. They fail. But then we make it to Jesus. When we make it to Jesus, things are a little bit different. Now Jesus, He's in a wild place. He's in the wilderness. Satan himself comes to Jesus and tempts him. And now what happens to Jesus? No, he doesn't give in. No, Jesus prevails. Where everyone else fails, Jesus has prevailed. He changes the pattern. He is tested even though he is trustworthy. And if we follow Jesus, we know that the same will be true for us. Think about it maybe like this. Think about it like this. If you went to, let's say you had to go to a doctor, had to have a medical procedure done, it would probably give you some comfort to see on that doctor's wall some certification or some qualifications of their degrees and their schooling and their level of practice, that you would know that, okay, I'm in good hands here. But let's say you went to the doctor and that doctor didn't have any of those things, so they probably couldn't be a doctor then. They'd never passed any of their exams. They'd never been to med school. They never, ever had done anything that it takes, never were tested in the ways that were necessary for them to become a doctor. You probably wouldn't have a lot of peace about that medical procedure, right? Like that, I would be a little bit nervous. There are almost no professions where you don't have to take some kind of test to be certified, some kind of qualification to be part of it. It's no different when we're following Jesus. Imagine if you asked me to do your wedding, and then you found out I wasn't an ordained minister. I'm an ordained minister. I don't know where my paperwork is. It's probably in my office somewhere. We can find it after the fact. But if you asked me to do your wedding and it turned out I wasn't an ordained minister, well, then I can sign the paper. I got a pretty signature. We can make that license look good. Put it in a frame, in your house, above your bed, whatever. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the state of Missouri is not going to recognize you as a lawfully wedded couple. If I am not qualified to do your wedding and I do your wedding, it doesn't count. Qualifications are normal. Tests are normal. It's normal in every other sphere of life. Why would we think it's any different when it comes to following Jesus? We can expect to be tested. We can expect to be tested, especially if we're someone who God trusts. We can expect to be tested if we're someone who God trusts. But the question for us then is, how are we going to respond when we're tested? Jesus, He responds to those tests with trust. In the midst of the test, what does Jesus do? He trusts God. So the question then for us, are we going to trust God in the midst of those tests? Because if we do, then God will prove that He is trustworthy, just as He does for Jesus here in these verses. Now the third phrase in verse 13, He was in the desert 40 days being tempted by Satan. He was in the desert or in the wilderness for 40 days and He was being tempted by Satan. Mark is incredibly unique in how he presents this temptation of Jesus. Incredibly unique because he presents it in a way that's relatable, right? This is easy. Like, this is a one-to-one correlation. Obviously, we are like Jesus here. Jesus, He fights Satan. Our fight is with the same. Our fight is with Satan. Our adversary is identical. Jesus is relatable because our adversary is identical to His adversary. That's what makes Jesus relatable in these verses, but Mark records this encounter with Satan in an incredibly unique way. Because if you're reading closely, then you probably notice that Mark doesn't say anything about Jesus winning. Doesn't say anything about how Satan is defeated. Doesn't say anything about how Jesus whips Satan. No, there's nothing included about Jesus' victory. We can assume that Jesus wins because the next few verses we see Jesus preaching the good news of the kingdom, bringing God's kingdom here on earth. Like we can assume that Jesus wins. We can assume that Jesus defeats Satan. But why would Mark leave that as sort of an open-ended question for us? Well, I think that what Mark's doing, and what most Bible scholars think that Mark is doing, is that he's showing us that in Mark chapter 1, the conflict has started. That Jesus versus Satan, this cosmic conflict has started. But that conflict won't reach its culmination until Mark chapter 16, when Jesus is hanging upon the cross and Jesus defeats death and hell and the grave and the devil himself once and for all and forever. That is what Mark is pointing to. By not saying that Jesus has defeated the devil, what Mark is doing is he's saying he hasn't defeated him yet. This conflict isn't over yet. The whole gospel is going to be an unfolding of this fight, but his defeat is coming. Jesus, he's already done the hard work. Jesus, he's already done what's difficult. He's already defeated the devil for us. He's already done what we could not do on our own. That's what Jesus has done for you and for me. He was in the desert 40 days being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals and the angels attended to him. Our adversary is identical. But what Jesus does here, I love it, I think it's so interesting, is that he heads out into the wilderness, right? Our adversary is identical, so what does Jesus do? Well, he heads out into the wilderness. He heads out into the place where the devil can be found. In the ancient world, devils and demons, they were associated with wild places. So what does Jesus do? He takes the fight to Satan. I love that. Like that's so tough. Like that's so mean. Like Jesus goes to Satan to throw down. But he beats Satan on his own turf. He beats Satan at his own game. Like how cool is that? That's how cool, that's how tough Jesus is. And I think that everyone would agree. There's something special about beating someone at their own game. There's something satisfying about beating someone at their own game. I had a buddy in high school. His name was Marty. And we used to play a lot of ping pong together. And at Marty, we played ping pong, okay? But Marty wanted to play table tennis. Big difference. Table tennis and ping pong. And really, when we played ping pong, what I mean is that we ended up playing, it kind of devolved into what's known as sting pong, where like you lift your shirt up over your face, cover up your important bits, and then your friends get to sting you with the ball. Like that's what we played, okay? Marty didn't want to play that game. No. Marty wanted to play table tennis. And Marty had all these rules that he brought to table tennis. And all these rules that he brought to table tennis so that he would have an advantage on us. You got to throw the ball up 6 inches. You got to hit it at a certain angle with the paddle. You got to hit a different side of the table. Like all these rules. And I thought, I was the kind of person that was so competitive that I thought, I'm just going to beat you at your own game. I'm going to beat you at your own game. I'm not going to give you the satisfaction of beating me with your rules. No, I'm going to beat you with your rules. I think that's what Jesus does here. He goes into the desert, he goes into the wilderness, goes on Satan's turf, and he beats him at his own game. But it's kind of tricky for us. It's kind of tricky for us because the Bible tells us that it's all Satan's turf. The Bible tells us that Satan, he is the prince of this world. So how can we beat the devil if he owns everything, if he's kind of in charge of the way things are going in this world? I think that's in part why bad things happen to good people, why there's so many sinful and horrible atrocities. So how can we possibly contend with the devil? Well, the good news is we don't have to. Like we said, Jesus, he's already done what is difficult. Jesus has already defeated Satan. Jesus has already defeated death and hell and the grave once and for all and forever upon the cross, which is exactly what Mark is pointing us to with this phrase. That's what Jesus has done for us. So maybe when our struggle with sin is just too much, maybe when we just can't overcome that one habit, maybe when it's just too much for us to bear and we just give in, maybe what's happening is we're not actually fighting that hard, and instead what's actually happening is we're indulging. Maybe what's happening is we're not even putting up a fight and we're just giving in, we're just surrendering. Maybe we're not fighting like Jesus fought here. Because if we're fighting, I can't think of like a more Sunday school answer way to present this, but I think that if we're fighting, it's going to look really simple. It's hard to do, but I think it's going to look really simple. If we're fighting temptation, if we're actively resisting the devil so that he will flee from us, there's 3 things that we're doing: that we're going to be going to church, we're going to be praying, We're going to be reading our Bible. I can't get any more Sunday school than that, but that's what Jesus was doing in preparation for this moment. It's what Jesus did after this moment throughout the entirety of his gospel. It's how we fight temptation. It's how we resist the devil. And it's so simple, but it's so hard for us to put into practice. Our adversary is identical, but he's already been defeated. He's already been defeated. So for us to struggle with sin, it's not that we struggle with sin, it's that we choose sin. When we struggle with sin, it's not because sin has a hold on us. No, sin has been defeated once and for all. That's what Jesus did for you and for me. So maybe what we actually have to do is fight like Jesus fought. Now this next phrase is also very unique in Mark's gospel. Verse 13 tells us that he was being tempted by Satan and he was with the wild animals. Jesus was with the wild animals. Now in the gospels, that verse shows up a few different ways, but only this way in Mark. Only the wild animals show up in Mark's gospel. There's Matthew, there's Mark, there's Luke. They all kind of tell a similar story about Jesus. John's off here, he's different. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all tell the similar story about Jesus. Nobody else mentions the wild animals, though. Why would Mark mention these wild animals that Jesus encounters in the wilderness? Well, some Bible scholars, they think this is a prophetic picture of heaven where Jesus brings peace to the lion and the lamb, where there's harmony between Jesus and all of the wild beasts. And then there's other Bible scholars who I like to identify with. They think that maybe what Mark is doing is he's showing his Roman readers that Jesus relates to them. He's showing them how relatable Jesus is, because when those Roman readers would hear about the wild animals, what they would think of, what they would be considering, what was brought to their mind was how Emperor Nero would execute Christians via wild animals in the Colosseum. What would come to their mind was how Nero would feed Christians to wild dogs in the streets of Rome. What would come to their mind was that Jesus, he was in danger, but Jesus was able to be delivered. And if Jesus was in danger, but Jesus was able to be delivered, maybe the same thing could be true for them. I think that's what makes Jesus so relatable here in this verse, that Jesus, he's in danger. He's among wild animals, but he's also delivered. Same thing is true for us when we follow Jesus faithfully. When we follow Jesus faithfully, we might find ourselves in danger, but we can trust that we will be delivered as well. Now, remember that guy, Steve Rinella. I mentioned him at the beginning. He's an author, like I said. He writes all kinds of good books, mostly about hunting and eating the food that you hunt. But he has this idea about raising kids, and I think he's onto something here. I think he's onto something, because what he does is he talks about how he likes to raise his kids in an arena of consequence. I think we've got the quote on the screen. An arena of consequence, meaning this is a place where actions produce results that you have to live with. That's what consequences are, right? He likes to raise his kids in a consequence-rich environment. A consequence-rich environment. He gives an example, Steve gives an example of raising his kids by, or teaching them how to chop wood with a hatchet. And by teaching them how to chop wood with a hatchet, it means turning his 8-year-old, 6-year-old, and 5-year-old loose with a hatchet and a bunch of unsplit wood. That's what he means, in a consequence-rich environment. I don't know if that's the way you should raise your kids. I know that there's a little bit of irony in me taking parenting advice from somebody who has centered their career on ending the lives of living things. Like there's irony in that. I understand. But I think that Mr. Rinella might be onto something here. I think that the arena of consequence is something we all live with. When we put our faith in Jesus, I think that an arena of consequence is real. Because there are very real consequences for very real actions, very real consequences for our very real decisions. When we decide to follow Jesus faithfully, we might face some dangers. We might face some risks. But those dangers and those risks, they don't mean that we can't be delivered. Now, we're not going to face wild beasts in the Colosseum. We're not going to face wild dogs in the streets. That's not what's going to happen for us. No, the dangers and the risks that we might face. Maybe what will happen is we run the risk of being mislabeled by our coworkers as a bigot, or as somebody who's hateful, or as somebody who's anti-intellectual, or as somebody who doesn't have any fun. Those are all mislabels that I've seen placed on Christians in our society today. Or maybe it means that when we put our faith in Jesus, when we follow Jesus faithfully, that we end up losing a few friends because they disagree with our position on faith. Maybe that's the danger that we are at risk for. Maybe that's what happens when we put our faith in Jesus. But those dangers and those risks, they don't mean that we cannot be delivered. If it was true for Jesus, then it can be true for us today because of just how far Jesus has gone to relate himself to us. Now, what we see in this last phrase is just that. We see that Jesus is delivered. We see that Jesus is attended to by angels. He was with the wild animals, and angels attended him. He was with the wild animals, and angels attended him. Jesus is alone. There's no one else around. It's just him in the wilderness fighting off temptation. It's happening with Jesus. It's what happens with us. Jesus is relatable here because even when we're alone, it doesn't mean that we're abandoned. Even when we feel alone, even when we think we're alone, even if we are literally physically alone, it does not mean that God has somehow abandoned us. Even when we're alone, we're not abandoned. Jesus, he wasn't abandoned here. No, God was faithful. And this is perfectly in connection with the tradition of Scripture. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew tradition says that Adam and Eve, they were attended to by angels in the garden. The Old Testament, the Hebrew tradition, tells us that Elijah, the preeminent prophet of God, he was attended to by angels in the wilderness. And now here we have Jesus attended to by angels in the wilderness. What is God trying to show Jesus? He's trying to show him, I am faithful. You might feel alone. You might feel like there's no one else around. You might even be alone, but you are not abandoned. Now what happens? Jesus is delivered. God is faithful. These angels come and they attend to his needs. Alone, but not abandoned. Now, I don't know how you guys are raising your kids, but I just had a kid, my wife and I haven't left him at church yet, which I consider a win. But when I was a kid, I recall that I was left at church once, and I was like, oh, this is perfect, like alone but not abandoned. And I texted my mom about this, okay? I remember being left at church once, and I texted my mom. I was like, hey, Mom, do you remember that time you left me at church? Can you give me the details on that story for a sermon? So I texted Mom, and my mom responded. She was like, no, I can't remember any time that I left you at church. Mom, I'm sorry. I know this is going to feel like I'm throwing you under the bus. I'll apologize now. You'll only be mad at me until you get to come and see your grandbaby again. But this is the deal. I am almost positive, 99% positive that my mom and dad left me at church once. I was alone, or I thought that I was alone. But in reality, I wasn't alone, and I definitely wasn't abandoned. The pastor was still there. All the old ladies were still chatting in the church lobby. And then my parents, they had to realize that their only child was not with them at some point. Like it just had to happen. And I realized then that I might have been alone. I might have felt alone, but I was not abandoned. What's going to happen for us if we follow Jesus faithfully is that there's going to be times where we're alone. There's going to be times where we're tempted. And there's going to be times where we have to do exactly what Jesus did, where we have to fight that temptation even though there's no one else around. Even though there's no one else around to know if we give in. Even if there's no one else around, we have to fight that temptation the same way Jesus did. The way we do it is by trusting that God has not abandoned us. We're going to be alone sometimes, maybe alone late at night, the computer in front of us. Nobody would know any different if we looked at something maybe we weren't supposed to. We're going to be alone maybe when we're paying our bills. No one would know if we gave God the 10% that he's due, but we would know. God would know. We're going to have to fight that temptation to be selfish, to hold on to what doesn't even, in fact, belong to us. We're gonna have to fight temptation when it comes to maybe scheduling our calendars out, looking at our Sundays and thinking about how it takes a lot to serve on a Sunday. It's a lot easier to just attend. Maybe I could be selfish this weekend. Maybe I could be selfish this weekend. Maybe I don't need to serve. Maybe no one would know if I just gave in to this temptation to be selfish. Alone, but not abandoned. When we're alone in those moments, when we're tempted in those moments, we have to remember that God hasn't abandoned us. Know that God will be faithful just as he was faithful to Jesus. What we've seen this morning is that Jesus, he is relatable. Jesus is relatable, but I think what we've seen even more is that tension has not yet been resolved. That Jesus, he's relatable, but we're not really like him. Really, I think what we've done this morning is we've come full circle. We've come full circle because we started off by saying, Jesus is a good character, right? We relate to him. We want to be like him. We share some experiences with him. That's a good character, but now I think we can go even one step further. We can go one step further because I think that we can say, Jesus, he's not just a good character. No, Jesus, he's the best kind of character because not only can we relate to him, but Jesus, he has related himself to us. Jesus relates to us, and that is why we can have relationship with him. This morning, maybe you're sitting here, you're thinking, man, I don't really know this Jesus guy. Like, this is the first time I've heard about him, Mark chapter 1, 12 and 13. That's my introduction to Jesus. I've got great news for you. Jesus is relatable. He's easy to get to know. It's hard to be like him, but it's not hard to get to know him. That's what we're all about here at New Life, is helping people know Jesus better than they do today. Let's say that's not you. Let's say maybe you're on the other spectrum, other end of the spectrum. You know Jesus, you follow him faithfully. You're like, yeah, Jesus is the best character ever. Well, I believe that for those of us who might be in that boat, then this text still challenges us. This text, it still encourages us, because even in those two sentences, I could just about guarantee that every person in this room, we'd be able to find a point where our character diverges from the character of Christ. We'd be able to find a point in our life where that gap between who we are and who we ought to be, between us and Jesus, is just a little bit too wide, where we have a little bit of work to do to become more like Jesus. See, Jesus is relatable. He's relatable because his temptation followed his triumphs just like ours. Jesus is relatable because he was tested even though God trusted him just like we are. Jesus is relatable because his adversary is our adversary. Jesus is relatable because when he was in danger, he could still be delivered. Jesus is relatable because even though he felt alone, he wasn't abandoned. Jesus is relatable, but even more so, he relates himself to us. How does he do that? Last week we saw it in Jesus' baptism. Jesus is baptized, the perfect and spotless and sinless Son of God, baptized for the repentance of sin. It makes no sense. Why would Jesus be baptized? He didn't need to. No, he did it so that he could identify with us, so that he could relate to us. This week, we see it in Mark 1, verse 12 and 13. The perfect, spotless Son of God, sinless Son of God, tempted in the wilderness. What is Jesus going to become some kind of profligate sinner? No. No, what Jesus is going to do is he's going to conquer temptation. He's going to identify with us. He's going to relate to us so that we can have relationship with him. And if we fast forward Mark's gospel, we look to Mark chapter 16. Look to the end of the story, what we see is that Jesus is related to us in the ultimate sense of the term. That Jesus, he quite literally and quite physically takes our place upon the cross. What Jesus did is he lived the life we ought to have lived. He died the death we ought to have died, and we get his life instead. That is the gospel. That is the story that Mark tells, even here in chapter 1 and all the way in chapter 16. That Jesus, he has gone to all lengths to relate to us so that we could have relationship with him. Let's pray together this morning. Jesus, thank you for what you've done, for making a way for us to relate to you, for making a way for us to know you. And Jesus, I pray for my friends in this room this morning who don't know you yet. Thank you, Jesus, for being so easy to get to know, for being so relatable, for not withholding any of yourself so that you could relate to us fully. Jesus, I pray for my friends in this room who've known you for a long time, but who also know that there's still a lot of work to be done if they want their life to line up with yours. Jesus, I think no matter where we stand with you, these verses, they challenge us, they encourage us in our hearts to know that we can relate to you, but we can only relate to you because of just how far you've gone to relate to us. Jesus, help us to find those places, to identify those parts of our lives where our character diverges from yours. Help us to bring our life in line with yours. Jesus, help us to know you better. Jesus, we're praying all these things in your name. Everybody said, amen.
Thank you for watching us on YouTube today. We hope that the content that you heard helped you know Jesus better.
Also, don't forget to click subscribe and to click the bell icon so that you'll get notified every time our channel drops a new video.
If you would like to partner with us in what God is doing here at New Life, there are 3 ways that you can give.
You can give by mailing a check to the church, you can give by going to giving.nlspringfield.com, or you can text 84321 with the amount that you'd like to give.
And if you would like to connect with us in any other way, you can visit us at nlspringfield.com, click on the Connect tab, and we will get back to you as soon as we can.
See you next week.